Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. This year's Chief of Army's History Conference focuses on mastering the Army profession, and together we're analysing Army's approach to our profession in the context of the past, reviewing culture, reviewing ethical dilemmas, our approach to discipline, how we view organisational structure, and how we value education and training. And as you're aware, the Chief has defined three pillars of our modern Army profession: jurisdiction, expertise, and you guessed it, self-regulation. And our session, this first session today, will contribute to this conference's combined body of knowledge by exploring discipline and self-regulation. We're joining you this morning in a hybrid format, and just as a reminder that all questions, when we get to Q&A, please use the login details from the QR app on your program or via your online registration details for those joining us virtually. I'm your moderator this morning for Session 1A. My name is Colonel James Groves. I'm the Director of Army Concepts and Experimentation in Future Land Warfare Branch. I'm excited and over the moon to be joining the team to my left. And I'd love to introduce you to our panellists this morning. Major Sam White from Army Headquarters. Sergeant Norman Daymirringu from Northforce. Dr. Bob Hall from UNSW Canberra, and Colonel Jim Waddell from Defence Legal. In the coming minutes, we're going to hear from each of these experts who bring with them a range of diverse professional experiences and history to bring credibility to these stories. We'll start off with controlling violence in a spectrum of competition. Sam and Norman are going to build on existing scholarship of Indigenous conflict management. They'll offer to us that Indigenous traditions offer practical insights into preserving the credibility of combat forces and of deterrence whilst limiting unnecessary destruction and unnecessary violence. They'll do this through analysing a couple of principles: sovereignty, proportionality, and empathetic reconciliation, and look at how they can apply to broader social and societal challenges facing Australia today. Their thesis is that adopting Indigenous models of restraint and reconciliation may enhance the resilience, reduce escalation risks, and provide alternative frameworks in future war. Shortly after that, we'll hear from Dr. Robert Hall. Now, Bob will talk about discipline in the 1st Australian Task Force in Vietnam. Bob will examine patterns in the discipline of our soldiers in Vietnam by focusing on 4 battalions from the period 1969 through to the Task Force's withdrawal in 1962, and identify that there were 3 very distinct operational environments: the Task Force base at Nui Dat, on ops, and brief periods of rest in country back at Vung Tau. And these 3 different operational environments also had equally different and identifiable differences in disciplinary profiles. Bob's thesis is that the rate and type of offending by national servicemen and Australian regular Army soldiers can be examined to interpret different means of interpreting discipline and imposing punishment. And then finally, before we get to Q&A, which we're really looking forward to, we'll hear from Colonel Jim Waddell from Defence Legal. Jim will take us through a bit of a longitudinal exploration, starting at the time of Federation, when Australia's military discipline system was entirely inherited from the UK, who themselves were going through a period of struggle between the Crown and Parliament in the 17th century. Jim will then talk all the way through to just after 1945, the inherited disciplinary services laws of the 3 services, but in particular the Army, were increasingly found to be archaic. But law reforms had played out over so many years as to be almost scandalous in their own right. Jim's thesis is that the court-martial system has generally stood the test of time, but the administration of discipline has proved challenging at unit level, and attempts to fix it have led to consequences that continue to bedevil the ADF in general and the Army in particular to this day. Thanks for joining us. I'm really excited. Let's hear from our first presenters.
Hi everyone, my name is Sam White. I'm at Army Headquarters where I work under the G1 cell a couple of days a week, and then the other days I'm at the Australian War Memorial where we're putting together the history of the first all-Indigenous unit, which was in 1942, a very conventional unit, part of the Orbat in Arnhem Land. So some of the photos you're going to see here are from 1942. They're from something called the Donald Thompson Collection. It's the first time that they'll be public, that we've been going through since 2019, cultural clearance to show the photos, and there's something called a makarata, which you may have heard of, but this is a very specific 1942 instance. We're not only just going to be focusing on that, but on Australia at large. So we've been told by Major Smith today that we have to look back as far as we can to look forward. I'm going to challenge you that we're going to look back at least 20,000 years so that hopefully we can look forward with some concepts to take into the modern battle space. Norm, do you want to explain the painting you've done?
Yeah, first of all, morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Daymirringu. I'm a Yolngu person from northern part of Australia in the tip. It's a top end called Arnhem Land. I'm a cultural leader and a traditional, authorised a traditional leader for the ceremony. I drive ceremonies and things, so I'm an elder leader in my community as well. As you can see the painting there, it's painted by myself, and that's indicate a king brown travelling from east to a middle of one of the near the Aeropress swamp in the mouth of Guida River. That's where the snake, the king brown, is settled in my country. So it's been a risk for him going through a number of fires that he finally settled in and found a burrow in Guida River, and he kind of hide in there, which is amongst with other venomous snake as well, like the Dasetta. And if he was carrying a spear, you could see the 4 spears on the side. So it's King Brown that settled in and found himself a burrow and a home in my country. So it's coming to be my totem. Thank you.
So we've heard today that war is shaped by geography, people, society, right? Law is no different. There's this big concept called critical legal theory that's pretty much, for those that don't want to do a law degree, I would say is the only correct theory of law. Law doesn't just spontaneously happen. It's why we keep reforming it. It reflects society. It adjusts to changes. Law is based on friction, right? Now that law, if we think about laws of war, discipline, etc., obviously will change from society to society, right? Because you're trying to protect certain things. Under the Geneva Conventions today, you can still put soldiers on parole, which means they go back home and they agree not to fight. That only makes sense if you think about the laws of war emerging from Europe, knights capturing each other, everyone going back on parole, right? That's how the Geneva Conventions are written today. But the laws of war are bigger than that. There are different histories. Now, if we look at this painting from 1778, it's not dated well, has it? It's not aged well. Britannia being offered the riches of the world. The East is there to give its riches to the West. This is how international law is framed in. This is the social fabric of international law. There are those who validly are protected by international humanitarian law. There are civilians who directly participate and therefore lose. You have concepts of just war, the jus ad bellum, jus in bello. These are all European concepts that flow through today, but they're not the only model. We've also heard today about General Sherman's March to the Sea. So Liber Code, Article 29, is the legal basis for that. It's based on this idea of sharp war. If you get rid of the rules, warfare is done quicker, right? Now, I'm not suggesting that Major Smith was advocating for that, but the Secretary of War in the US did. He recently talked about stupid ROE that is constraining the hands of the US military. This is part of a cultural phenomenon called sharp war, but historically it's not based. There's no society at all, and it's a big statement, you can hold me to it, there is no society that believes in absolute total war. It is part of the human condition, the social contract, that when people come together, there are rules, right? So if we have to operate within a framework of rules, then we should look at rules outside of British history or European history to look at what lessons we can draw. Okay. This is a problem in 1901. How do you defend a continent? There were over 250 nations, sovereign concepts that set boundaries that existed in Australia. From that, it was recognised quite early in the piece that there were rules in Australia before the British. Rights of asylum, international trade law, and ultimately what very colonial perspectives accepted at the time, that there was even an early stage of international law in Australia before the British. And it was based on an idea of strict territory. How can language grow? Why do people from Yorkshire sound different to people from Lancashire, right? Because people don't move that much. Language drifts, language changes. I can say that my wife's from Yorkshire and I can barely understand her sometimes. Same problem happened here. People emerging from Sydney would go up into the Blue Mountains and the interpreters that they had wouldn't be able to understand the language over the hill. Why? Because people were set in spots for so long, static boundaries, that language shifted dramatically. And that's based on military capacity. This here is the sort of earliest sketch that we can find by an Indigenous man depicting Indigenous warfare. So it's from down near Ulladulla, right? But this is through the colonial lens. This is some of the photos that I've been referencing. So 1942, it's assessed that the Japanese are going to land from New Guinea, come across to Groot Island, Milingimbi air bases, and use that to bomb the central of Northern Territory. A Special Forces unit is created by Squadron Leader Donald Thompson, who goes around and he collects through his Indigenous private at the time. His name is Rewala Miljingi, and they go around Arnhem Land, uniting different clans. It culminates in something called a makarata, and Norm's going to talk about the photos now.
Yeah, as Sandy said, we had a cultural clearance discussing with my elders throughout Arnhem Land, and we agreed upon and had approval to show the pictures of Miljingi, Rewala and things. So you see the picture here is indicating that the lady is standing in the middle of the war. It's really significant wording that we use, makarata, where it's really makarata, it's some form of where we testified, and it's a law and justice and peace, where many things approach together to reunite and unify the, for instance, where Donald Thompson had to send Rewala Miljingi to kind of collect all the Yormas throughout Arnhem Land to form a reconnaissance unit, which is army. And it has been two set of war happening at the moment during that time of period back in 1942, where there was a war between the Japanese and the war between Yorma to Yorma as for the collection and approaching and using the word makarata. But the lady there standing in the middle, it's just kind of been giving rapery as a discipline between the two soldiers to kind of reunite and unify together. So we call her a lady. She has a responsibility and a role, and her position is a miak with gongdorna. So he is her own a role model in the lady have his own and the men have their own. So it's just kind of getting to reunite them back. Thank you.
So part of what you see here, and what Norm's saying, is you have an umpire in the middle, yep, right? Giving the orders both before and after, someone that during the process can intervene within the conflict. And part of the field interviews that we've been doing to contextualise this has raised some quite interesting modern applications. Often the question asked in Arnhem Land is, when we fight China, who's the umpire, right? This is a concept of violence that's not potentially known to us. Two answers maybe come up. The International Committee of the Red Cross, who notably don't carry a stick to beat us if we don't follow, or international law, right? But this is part of that process, controlling violence Violence ultimately is a social construct. It's something that you learn and regulate through the cultural lens that you have. Violence, before British colonisation in Australia, violence is a public matter. It's not men's business, it's not women's business, it's everyone's business. There is a requirement that all people are involved in controlling violence, a very different framework to perhaps the professional military of today. So, this isn't just theoretical, right? And when we talk about the oldest rules, the oldest laws of war, the oldest discipline, we can start 60,000 years ago. But realistically, if we look at artwork, right? Artwork is where you get a lot of primary sources. Around 10,000 years ago, there's the first depiction of mass violence on the Australian continent. Big battles, people killing each other, spears in bodies. This is enough to be depicted in artwork. It also corresponds to the last glacial period. So both the desert is growing in the centre of Australia and the sea levels are rising. People are moving, there is competition over resources. In the artwork, we find, especially in Arnhem Land, increasing complexities in weapon systems. You have the idea of a woomera or a galpu. The spear thrower starts to come in. Barbed spears, killing spears emerge within the artwork. But then after 8,000 years of fighting, violence disappears from the artwork. There is a system that has evolved enough that big-scale violence isn't really relevant anymore for paintings. Now, what is that system? So part of the doctrinal research that Colonel Groves is talking about is some work that I've done. We're looking across the Australian continent, trying to track different laws of war before the British. There are many consistencies, including messengers are always protected, which links in now to the idea of if you have a white flag, there are protected symbols. But mainly, at its absolute core, is the idea of payback. Reciprocity, it is the basis of international law today, and it is the basis of the laws of war within Australia before the British. Eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, that sort of thing, but it's on a bigger scale. So this is where a makarata comes in. Again, we're going to go through some of the photos and Norma will explain it, but the main takeaway here is that reciprocity, that thing we just can't get away from within international law, it's the tension that we talk about with stupid ROE, or the fact that we're applying the Geneva Conventions but they're not, right? These complaints come back to the idea of reciprocity. But it's something that's been regulated within Australia for thousands of years. No?
Yeah, just going back to the makarata, it's whole theme of makarata. It's like I said before earlier, it's law and justice in peace as well. So as you can see the picture, they indicate people are standing and watching the two groups of clan groups on the far end, and on the side here, you can see the lady and the children are standing out there, just standing and watching the makarata as they're approaching together to kind of justify and meet up together and group up as a clan group. So it's a really hard to kind of go through borders and boundaries and barriers, which is the areas are more restricted coming from all clan groups. And that's what my people used to do before they back there, is to go through and dodge a number of spears to kind of meet and greet and shake hands. As you can see, the group up here are walking, the group are sitting down, all from different clan group sections, coming from different areas and borders and boundaries. And to kind of testify and come to unify, they have to go through the makarata, which is kind of bit violence, but dodging spears. And that's the how we meet and greet. End of the day, when everybody's spears are done, then come and shake hands and unify together. So to be able to approach a clan group, it's to see one of the Wungu's son there. It's doing a shark dance, which is kind of performance and representing his clan group. So the other clan groups are saying that, all right, that's shark people are coming to fight us. As you can see there, it's between the shark people and the crocodile people dancing and performing and indicating themselves that we are coming to do the battle, to kind of go through this law and justice, to testify. Then they got the other group up there dancing there, the Pelican dance. So it's whole, lots of history remains and lots of stories in Arnhem Land where, like I mentioned earlier, there was some Roy Daymirringu had to go through festive wild crocs, swim across, collecting each clan group from thing, but to able to kind of collect that is going through the makarata system where to testify and have a violence and thing. So as they settle down, and this is where the head leader of Kulera, Wurungalapal, standing there and watching them and being a high witness is Wurungalapal on the side there. It's not painted. It's just been like a umpire, as Sam mentioned, so it's more of a hierarchy. His level is like a professor or doctor looking at them and witnessing them fighting and thing. And yeah, and you can see Daymirringu Rawola running, dodging the spear, asking for some collection to get all the soldiers together to unify. And like I mentioned, like there's in Trial Bay, there was a big makarata happened. There were blood spews. The blood covered all the beach area up in Arnhem Land, and that's it's really all big king range of story to tell. And you know, it's two worlds war happened at the same time, where Daymirringu had to go and collect and do another war with Yolngu and come back and do a war with the Japanese. Yeah.
So the photo that you can see here, which we finish on, is the culmination of the makarata. You can see towards the far right of the photo, the man walking with the spear up an arm in his hand, yeah, about to spear the young man who's gone through the makarata. If we take Clausewitz, we take General Smith's concept that war has to have an element of violence, there's a lot of easy dismissal of this as not being war, right? If this is the continuation of politics, right, this is violent, people must be speared. There's no concept of a peacekeeping operation where no shots are fired. You can only do a makarata if someone is going to be speared. They'll be put through the leg, a maka, hence makarata. You'll get speared through the leg. And at the end of that, though, is the interesting part of this system. Because the person that speared you also has to look after you. Now, I'm not saying that this applies in modern world. We shouldn't then turn around and look after the people that we've just been fighting. But this is an alternate framework for how to control violence. There is no concept of peace and war in Australia before the British. There is only a spectrum of competition. You are concurrently cooperating with your neighbours, competing with them over resources, flowing into conflict. It's a particular state of affairs that in turn created a particular system of law, right? Now, if you agree with me on that, it works perfectly in a spectrum of competition. The Geneva Conventions are written perfectly for large-scale conflict. It's why after every big war we have to do new Geneva Conventions. After Vietnam, we have the additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions. Law is trying to keep up to date. This is a system that has evolved to perfectly balance campaigning and competition. So there's three basic principles. First one is to protect sovereignty. That is a massive red line. Any foot that goes over territory results in automatic payback, right? It is a no-go within campaigning in a spectrum of competition for someone to sneak into your land bit by bit. Instantly will be dealt with. Vice versa, you want to avoid escalation, which is where the makarata has developed. It is a system that has evolved in order to allow punishment to happen for breaches of sovereignty, but in turn doesn't resolve in huge, large-scale battles. And the final one, which might seem interesting and odd for military professionals, is to be empathetic, right? And so I'll finish with this quote. This is not in Arnhem Land, this is in Queensland. And it's the reflection of a police officer who's seen a makarata equivalent in Queensland. And he couldn't understand culturally why you would be earnestly trying to kill your enemies and then at the end of it sit down and have dinner together, right? It's because if you're working in a spectrum of competition, you inevitably have to work together after the battle, right? After conflict has occurred, you have to go back and you have to start working together. This idea of invading each other's capitals, burning down the cities, putting your flags up, works fantastic for conventional warfare. It doesn't work within this concept of competing, right? Oh, final one. So this is part of a bigger project at Army Headquarters called Project Greenskin. I'm not sure if anyone here has been a participant on it, but over the next coming years, we take senior enlisted leaders and we take them on country for a week or so to learn about the different methods of violence control across the continent. We'll leave it there. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Norman. Thank you, Sam. We'll now hear from Dr. Bob Hall as he takes us through his analysis of discipline in the 1st Australian Task Force, Vietnam. Dr. Bob.
So the research I'm going to briefly describe today is based on an analysis of charge reports, and it's mainly focused on the disciplinary record of 4 infantry battalions for which complete records are available. The charge report of the Vietnam era recorded the slight glitch in the slides. Recorded the offender's name, obviously, his regimental number, his rank, subunit, the date and place of the offence, the nature of the offence, the finding, the punishment awarded and other details. So the charge reports provide us with a vast body of information about patterns that emerge in the offences, in the commission of offences. In this presentation, I'll be describing some of those patterns. Before I start, though, I want to remind us of where some of the places that I'll be talking about are, mainly Nui Dat, located in the centre of the Australian area of operations, and Vung Tau, the city of Vung Tau, where soldiers took short periods of leave. I'm not having... Oh, there we are. This table shows the total offences in the 4 infantry battalions according to where the offence took place. The first 3 battalions, 5, 9 and 8 RAR, each served a full 1-year tour in Vietnam, but 4 RAR NZ was the last battalion to serve in the campaign and had a shortened tour. As an Anzac battalion, it also had only 3 Australian rifle companies. The attached New Zealand companies had their own disciplinary processes and aren't included in the data I'm presenting. So that needs to be borne in mind when comparing the battalions. The data is shown according to the locations where the offences occurred, at Nui Dat, on operations, or while on leave at Vung Tau. The number of offences in each battalion varies considerably. 9 RAR soldiers recorded nearly twice as many offences as 8 RAR. 4 RAR NZ, with fewer Australians and a shorter tour, recorded about the same number of charges as 8 RAR. In each battalion, far fewer offences are recorded by units on operations than at Nui Dat or Vung Tau. But to better understand this data, we need to look at how many days units spent at each of those locations. Of a typical 1-year tour of duty in Vietnam, most infantrymen spent about 90 days at Nui Dat, 260 days on operations, and only 6 days on leave at Vung Tau. And that gives an average rate of offending for each battalion or each location, I should say, as shown in this table. Soldiers on operations appear to be exceptionally well behaved, with a very low rate of offending. On the other hand, the short leave breaks at Vung Tau account for a very large proportion of total offences. However, we need to look at the types of offences soldiers were committing at each place. And I'll start with Nui Dat, where I should go back. Where's back? The back signal doesn't seem to be functioning. Where do I get back to? Okay. Yeah, okay. So these are offences at Nui Dat by type. I've simplified these tables As you can imagine, there are lots of different sorts of charges, but I'm showing the top 4. Most infantrymen used to operations beyond the Nui Dat perimeter regarded the Nui Dat base as a relatively safe haven. The more relaxed atmosphere within Nui Dat contributed to offences. Alcohol-related offences include drunkenness, drinking at unauthorised locations or at unauthorised times, having grog in the tent lines, stealing grog and similar offences. Task Force SOPs required that soldiers remain capable of defending the base at all times. SOPs set strict controls on the consumption of alcohol within Nui Dat, requiring that alcohol be consumed only in the company canteen and only at prescribed times. Each infantry battalion company had its own soldiers' boozer, a shed usually with a bar dispensing beer and soft drinks. Consumption of alcohol in the tent lines, that is not in the designated areas, was an offence. Beer was rationed. Soldiers were allowed 2 cans per man per day while they were at Nui Dat, but many believed that a huge supply was building up for them every day they were on operations. Alcohol provided soldiers with an opportunity to wind down and talk about recent combat incidents after operations. The first night back at Nui Dat, following a typical 6-week operation, was usually marked with excessive alcohol consumption. Beer was incredibly cheap, only 10 cents a can, or about 90 cents in today's money. The majority of alcohol-related offences stemmed from soldiers smuggling alcohol into their tent lines and continuing to drink after lights out. To build their illicit stocks, soldiers sometimes stole beer from the boozer or smuggled bottles of spirits into Nui Dat after visits to Vung Tau. Being in possession or drinking alcohol outside the boozer were frequent and serious offences. It's worth noting that each of the murders in 1ATF, the fragging death of Lieutenant Burse and Lieutenant Convery, and the shooting of sergeants in the Task Force Maintenance Area mess involved excessive alcohol consumption by the perpetrators. Absence refers to the absence without leave, failure to appear at a place of parade, absence during lights out, bed check and similar offences. Offences of absence without leave or failure to appear at a place of parade were mainly the result of soldiers visiting other units within Nui Dat, sometimes for drinking parties, without getting clearance to do so, or staying out beyond the lights out bed check. There were very few opportunities for soldiers to leave the base. Duty refers to failures to perform duties such as sleeping on sentry duty, failing to be alert or leaving duty before proper relief. This cluster of offences relates mainly to the long hours of sentry duty at Nui Dat in the bunkers and perimeter watchtowers. This duty was very boring, especially to infantrymen accustomed to being out of the wire on operations, and they tended to regard the base as highly secure and therefore of very low security risk. The temptation to doze, to read or to listen to a transistor radio was ever present. Those scheduled for duty were barred from consuming alcohol. Weapons-related offences included accidental discharge of weapons, failure to maintain weapons and loss of weapons. Soldiers appear to have been less careful about the maintenance of weapons and weapon handling generally when they were in Nui Dat. Accidental discharges of weapons were usually associated with cleaning of weapons. Now I'd like to turn to operations, offences on operations. Offences on operations stand in contrast to those committed at Nui Dat. First, the rate of offending drops from about 3 offences per day in Nui Dat to 1 offence every 4 days on operations. One of the reasons for this is that several types of offence simply cease to exist for infantrymen on operations. There's almost no access to alcohol. The small number of alcohol-related offences on this table are related usually to operations that involve soldiers being near villages on searches or on checkpoints where they can have access to alcohol. Offences relating to dress and bearing cease to exist for soldiers on operations. There are no opportunities for absence without leave or failure to appear at a place of parade, so those offences disappear, and there are no vehicle-related offences. Failure to properly perform duties, such as sleeping on picket, continue, but at a much reduced rate. The 6-week operations with constant patrolling and lengthy periods of sentry duty each night led to soldiers falling asleep or being inattentive on sentry duty despite their best efforts. On operations, soldiers often felt deeply embarrassed if they had an accidental discharge of their weapon or if they fell asleep on sentry. Most saw those types of offences as letting their mates down, and they were keen to avoid them. Soldiers on operations were easier to lead than back at Nui Dat. Despite higher states of weapon readiness on operations, there are fewer unauthorised discharges and other weapon-related offences when soldiers are on operations. Soldiers were paying more attention to their weapons on operations. Insubordination and disobeying a lawful command continue, but they're also sharply reduced. And I think this is because soldiers understand that on operations they function as a team and that accepting the team norms is the best way to ensure their own survival. These are offences at Vung Tau. It was during periods of leave at Vung Tau that the average rate of offending reached its peak at about 30 offences per day. And once again, the type of offence changes. Absence without leave or breaking curfew and similar offences skyrocket at Vung Tau. This is the result of soldiers ignoring or forgetting the 2200 hours curfew or seeking to shack up with prostitutes for the night. Many soldiers who successfully shacked up surrendered themselves the following morning and accepted the charge and the small fine that resulted as a minor price to pay for an enjoyable night. When soldiers went on leave in Vung Tau, they wore civilian clothes and they were required to carry an ID card. It's the only time that they were required to carry an ID card, and many forgot. Offences against authority were mainly soldiers resisting military police patrols. Alcohol-related offences shrink to a fraction of those committed at Nui Dat, and this is because soldiers were free to drink as much as they liked when they were on leave in Vung Tau. Those alcohol-related offences that are recorded at Vung Tau are usually drunken brawls with Vietnamese civilians or with military police patrols. Interestingly, for offences committed at Nui Dat or at Vung Tau, dealt with through the formal disciplinary processes, the 4 infantry battalions I studied took quite different approaches to punishment. The approaches of 9 RAR and 8 RAR stand as an extreme example. Punishments could range from periods of up to 28 days detention in the military jail at Vung Tau through to days of confinement to barracks, or CB, and field punishment, fines, down to reprimands. In 8 RAR, when a formal charge was used, it usually drew a harsh punishment. For example, periods of detention in the military jail were regarded as the most severe punishment, and 8 RAR awarded detention in 44 cases compared to 9 RAR's 13 or 5 RAR's 6. In all, 8 RAR soldiers spent a total of 700 days in detention, whereas 9 RAR soldiers spent less than half that time. 9 RAR made much heavier use of confinement to barracks and field punishment than 8 RAR. These punishments had the offender undergoing their punishment within the unit and involved extra drill, working parties and bans on access to the soldiers' boozer and other entertainments. But although a punishment of confinement to barracks could be awarded, the offender might only serve a few days of that punishment before he joined the rest of his platoon when the next operation started. CB and field punishment couldn't be used as a means of avoiding operational duty. Although 8 RAR charged fewer soldiers, the punishments awarded tend to be more severe. correcting minor misdemeanours without resort to a formal charge had the effect of elevating a charge to the status of a serious offence in the minds of soldiers, and that appears to have discouraged them from committing offences. By contrast, in 9RAR, the charge seemed to have been devalued by its use for trivial offences. The low level of ill discipline while on operations was partly due to the lack of opportunity to commit several types of offence. But another factor is the much higher use of informal discipline. Informal discipline, including summary punishments, is discipline that doesn't comply with the military law. It was an offence in itself. Once on operations, junior commanders found it far better to issue a quick reprimand or other punishment to an offending soldier than a formal charge. The formal charge wouldn't be heard until weeks later when the platoon returned to Nui Dat. Meanwhile, the commander has a heavily armed soldier walking behind him, brooding about the injustice of his charge. It was usually much better to deal with the offence quickly with a few sharp words and possibly a punishment, and then to move on, letting the soldier know that the issue was over and that the expectation was that he would not offend again. This allowed him to refocus on his job and the platoon. However, informal punishments could potentially create problems. The use of violence, overly severe punishments or humiliating punishments could build resentment and break down small group cohesion. Soldiers generally accepted the disciplinary system without complaint. There were some complaints about the severity of punishments, but I found very few about the justice of the charge itself. Soldiers were not helpless victims of tyrannical NCOs or officers. They had ways of dispensing their own discipline as they saw it. At one extreme is the fragging murder of Second Lieutenant Robert Convery. A soldier in Convery's platoon murdered him by leaning over the blast wall around his tent and placing a hand grenade in his bed as he slept. In the court-martial that followed, it emerged that the soldier's motives was that Convery had been inconsistent in his punishments. On the night of the murder, Convery had disciplined some of his soldiers for drinking in the tent lines, when the soldier knew that Convery had done the same thing himself. Threats to kill were not uncommon. A good example is this elaborate grenade booby trap set up in a senior NCO's tent by an unknown disgruntled soldier. There was no intent to kill in this case. The grenade had been rendered harmless, but the incident carried the message that a live grenade could be used next time. There were many similar messages. The blowing up of a water heater reserved for officers, the leaving of grenade pins or rounds of ammunition on the target's bed, written notes, and of course verbal threats. In most cases, the perpetrator could not be identified, so those incidents don't appear in the records of charge reports. But verbal threats usually resulted in a charge of insubordination or threatening language. Most verbal threats were by drunken soldiers and were directed against military policemen, but some were much more calculated and directed against the soldiers' commanders. It sounds obvious, but harsh but fair discipline actually appears to encourage better discipline. This underscores the need for junior NCOs and officers to avoid the temptation to be liked by the men they command. It's much better that they're respected and that they're regarded as professionally competent. Drug use, which was a scourge of the US forces in Vietnam, was hardly noticeable in the Australian task force. Informal discipline appears to have been widely used throughout, although there's little hard evidence to support that claim. I know that I used it myself as a platoon commander, and I know that other platoon commanders used it as well, other platoon commanders and junior NCOs. Junior commanders need a quick, simple method of disciplining their men and keeping minor disciplinary matters within the small group. That builds cohesion, reinforces the authority of the junior commander. So that's I think, an important achievement. But the use of violence or humiliation in formal discipline can destroy group cohesion. So some guidelines are needed to help junior commanders navigate that line. There was very little in the way of doctrine to assist junior commanders with discipline. There needs to be some training and ideally recognition that informal discipline was a thing, it's going to happen anyway, and junior commanders needed training in how to apply it and how to avoid its pitfalls. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bob. And next we'll hear from Defence Legal's very own Colonel Jim Waddell. Jim will wrap up the presentation component of our session and he will discuss military discipline in Australia from Federation. Jim.
Well, good morning, everyone. My task will be to provide an overview of the systems of military discipline from Federation onwards. Military discipline is a function of command, but commanders have always had to work within the codes of discipline approved by Parliament. For that reason, the discipline systems have sometimes reflected political compromises or political sentiments, and discipline codes have therefore sometimes been suboptimal. But there have been many occasions when commanders have either found administrative workarounds to produce better outcomes or have raised awareness of defects in the system and pressed the government to have the legislation amended. As things stood immediately before Federation, the defence legislation of the Australian colonies was a hodgepodge which relied on or replicated British discipline codes, some of which had been designed for permanent forces, while others for volunteer or militia forces. Every colony had a different system from that of its neighbours. For our purposes, the two significant British codes at the time were in the Army Act 1881 and the Naval Discipline Act 1866, two acts of the Imperial Parliament for the discipline of Britain's permanent forces throughout the world. The discipline systems set up by these codes provided a gold standard for discipline, which many self-governing colonies, including the Australian colonies, applied to some or all of their colonial forces, either at all times or at least when their forces had been called out for active service. So the discipline code under the Army Act was applied to the New South Wales contingent to the Sudan in 1885 and to all the various contingents sent from Australia to the Boer War. Likewise, the naval volunteers from Victoria and New South Wales and a ship from South Australia sent to help quell the Boxer Rebellion in 1900 were placed under the Naval Discipline Act while abroad. Let's look at the system under the Army Act. Like our modern-day system, it operated at two levels, a court-martial system and a summary system administered by commanding officers for minor breaches of discipline by soldiers. The two main types of court-martial were general courts-martial, consisting of at least 5 officers, and district courts-martial with more limited powers, consisting of at least 3 officers. There was a variant called a field general court-martial, which could be convened overseas or on active service with more streamlined procedures. And that drawing shows a court-martial in 1885 of the Victorian Permanent Artillery members at Victoria Barracks in Melbourne. The Army Act created a range of offences across disparate categories. It included offences in relation to the enemy and offences punishable more severely if committed on active service than at other times. And here is the range of punishments available under the Army Act. Soldiers on active service sentenced to field punishment, which had replaced flogging, were kept in irons for a set period of days, and if subject to field punishment number 1, were attached to fixed objects for shorter periods during execution of the sentence. Field punishment number 1 was abolished in 1923, and the consequences of other field punishment were ultimately ameliorated and came to mean additional duties or drills and the loss of privileges, and the imposition of restraint was limited to exceptional circumstances. When the Defence Act came into force in 1904, it set up dual systems for the military and the naval forces, meaning that each service had 2 separate discipline codes, one for peace and another one for war. The peacetime codes were contained in regulations made under the Defence Act, while the wartime codes were those contained in the Imperial Acts, the Army Act and the Naval Discipline Act. This had not been the outcome sought by the Defence Department, which wanted to apply the Imperial codes at all times. Rather, these dual systems of separate codes emerged during debate in the House of Representatives, giving expression to a political sentiment seeking to proclaim a sense of difference from the mother country and its people, and to demonstrate a certain independence of action. In other words, the dual systems, in which each service had 2 separate discipline codes to be applied in different circumstances, were imposed as a matter of political sentiment, not because they were better systems. For the military forces, the dual system would later prove to be a real impediment to discipline, and attempts to change it later on failed, again for political reasons. On the other hand, when the Royal Australian Navy was being formed in 1910, it was allowed to dispense with its dual system. The reason for this was the changed strategic circumstances and a recognition that to create a professional navy, absolute interoperability with the Royal Navy would be necessary, including with respect to discipline. Now, this drawing depicts, or at least was inspired by, a naval court-martial held in 1938 in Sydney Harbour on board the depot ship HMAS Penguin. Notice the cocked hats, the frock coats and the sword laid out on the court-martial table. So far we've looked at how the discipline systems were set up following Federation. Now we'll look at how they worked, especially during the 2 World Wars. For the military forces, transition from the peacetime code proved to be a significant impediment to discipline in 1915 in Egypt and Gallipoli. That was because AIF officers, accustomed to using the peacetime code, lacked familiarity with the Army Act. So the AIF struggled under the stress of war to conduct courts-martial. Again, in the early years of the Second World War, the second AIF, again by reason of unfamiliarity, found itself ill-equipped to apply the Imperial Discipline Code, but it did eventually adapt. One of the teething problems of the dual system was the criterion, the trigger for changing over from the peacetime code to the wartime code. Until now, the criterion had been active service, defined so widely as to produce absurdities in practice. So in 1917, the Defence Act was amended by introducing the concept of war service as the criterion for enlivening the Imperial Discipline Code. The war service criterion, which included any naval or military service in time of war, was easier to apply. During the First World War, the best innovation, producing the most significant improvement in discipline, was a simple administrative workaround rolled out from 1916 across all the British armies. It was a scheme for employing legal experts at formation headquarters in France, initially at corps headquarters, but later extended to divisional headquarters. A court-martial officer would sit as a specialist member on every field general court-martial and would review and advise his commander on completed court-martial proceedings. The first court-martial officer for the AIF was Second Lieutenant Eric Johnson, a Hobart solicitor on the headquarters of the 1st Anzac Corps, and there he is at the centre of this photo taken in 1918. The effect of these appointments was to greatly improve the legal standard of courts-martial conducted in the field, and to relieve senior officers from the administrative burden of having to read numerous records of evidence for the purpose of post-trial review and confirmation. In the Second World War, the innovations that did most to promote discipline were also administrative workarounds. In 1940, the Adjutant General had underestimated the volume of offending that the second AIF would generate, and soon there were over 200 men in custody across the Middle East who had been held for 3 to 4 months pending trial. Part of the solution was to establish standing courts-martial and to appoint permanent presidents of courts-martial. Like all courts-martial, standing courts-martial were convened separately, but they sat continuously with the same members and therefore functioned efficiently as if they were a standing court. Likewise, a permanent president was appointed for separate courts-martial, but it was the same man day in, day out. These innovations became common in the second half of the war and promoted consistency in sentencing and efficiency in dealing with heavy caseloads. Since 1911, the RAN had been in lockstep with the Royal Navy to a very high degree. And it's an extraordinary fact that for the duration of both world wars, all seagoing ships, officers and men of the RAN were transferred to the British Admiralty. This led to minor differences in how the Imperial Discipline Code was applied as between different parts of the Navy. Since the establishment of the Air Force in 1921, its discipline had operated under local regulations, and parliamentarians had studiously avoided applying the Imperial Air Force Act to Australia. But in 1939, the imperative to cooperate with Britain and other dominions in the Empire Air Training Scheme forced Parliament to switch on the Imperial Discipline Code for the RAAF, and that system remained in place until 1985. And that's a painting of an RAAF court-martial sitting in London in 1942 by an Australian official war artist, Colin Colohan. By 1946, Australia's military discipline law comprised what Neil Preston has claimed was probably the most complex army code in the British Empire. If we had more time, I would talk about the Reid Board of Inquiry, which essentially fired a starter's gun on efforts in Australia to reform the military discipline system, at first limited to the Army, but eventually extending to a new discipline code common to the three services. But the protracted, deliberative process that followed didn't produce any substantive outcome for nearly 40 years. By that time, the archaic character of military law in Australia had become almost a matter of public scandal. And here's what one commentator had to say about it in 1964, looking at the military discipline law of Australia. He saw the residue of a colonial mentality, a determination to patch a British garment rather than making a new one, the preoccupation with internal divisions and jealousies at the cost of overall efficiency. With more time, I would talk about the modernisation of British service law in the 1950s, which caused particular difficulties in Australia for the Army because we relied on their legislation so greatly. I would talk about the challenges for the Australian discipline reform process that followed the election of the Whitlam government in 1972, which sought to impose newer concepts of civil liberty. The Whitlam government required that the new discipline code should model as closely as possible the procedure of the ordinary civil courts, and that encroachment on the personal liberty and rights of servicemen should equate closely with the ordinary civil law. I would talk about a particular sticking point, that being a proposal to dispense with the inquisitorial discipline procedure, which had long been employed at summary level by commanding officers in the Army and the Air Force, which involved a formal two-way dialogue with the accused. And there's a picture of a two-way dialogue taking place between the CO and a soldier on a charge. Critics of this system likened the role of the commanding officer to that of a prosecutor and claimed it wasn't really a trial. Yet it possessed some of the characteristics of a criminal trial, including the opportunity for the accused to cross-examine and to call his own witnesses. I would note that the Army and the Air Force ultimately lost that fight, and that the adversarial summary procedure used in the Navy, which resembled a criminal trial in a magistrate's court, was imposed on the entire Defence Force by means of the Defence Force Discipline Act from the 3rd of July 1985. I would note that the adversarial system, with a prosecutor and a defending officer, in which the commanding officer was cast in the role of a judge and was bound to observe the rules of evidence, even when dealing with extremely minor discipline offences, introduced a level of formality and complexity at unit level, which over time has probably contributed to an alarming trend of diminishing use of the discipline system at summary level. With more time, I would note that from 1985, the DFDA essentially replicated the previous court-martial system of two tiers, albeit with modifications such as the introduction of Defence Force magistrates, and that the system was repeatedly tested by legal challenges taken to the High Court. But the system generally survived those challenges. I would note the abolition in 2006 of convening authorities, being formation commanders and other senior officers whose many disparate functions associated with the convening of courts martial increasingly seemed to collide with the notion of a fair trial contained in human rights law. And I would note the division of their functions between an independent director of military prosecutions and an independent registrar. Finally, with more time, I would note that a parliamentary inquiry in 2005, somewhat radically, called for the abolition of the court-martial system and the creation of a permanent federal court for the trial of serious military offences. While not going quite that far, the Howard government in 2007 implemented a compromise solution by creating an Australian military court. But it operated for less than 2 years before the legislation underpinning it was dramatically struck down by the High Court as being unconstitutional. After a short hiatus, the previous system of trial by court-martial or Defence Force magistrate was reintroduced, and that system continues to this day. So, recognising that the discipline codes have sometimes been suboptimal, there have been many occasions when commanders have found administrative workarounds, or have raised awareness of defects in the system and pressed the government to fix them. The best examples of administrative workarounds were the court-martial officer system of the First World War, and in the Second World War, the appointment of standing courts-martial and permanent presidents of courts-martial. And finally, that's a photo of a general court-martial sitting in Vietnam in 1971 for the trial of Private Faraday. This is one that Bob alluded to. Faraday was charged with 2 counts of murder and 1 of malicious wounding. On Christmas Day 1970, Faraday, in a drunken state, had opened fire through the open side of the Task Force maintenance area, Sergeant's Mess. Thank you.
Thank you, gentlemen. That was outstanding. We move now into the Q&A component of session 1A. And before I call upon my friends over on table 14 who have been furiously collating all the online questions, I think we've needed 17 iPads to catch them all. Is that right? Good, excellent. I would encourage you, when thinking about the focus of the questions that may be inspired in the next 5 or 10 minutes, really centre them on discipline and self-regulation and the role that they play in enabling the third pillar of the Army as a profession. And in terms of framing them, think not only on the historical precedents that have been described to us, but how the historical examples really add to what the academics would call the weight of the past or the gravity of the past, that when contextualised in the present can then allow us to envisage what sort of future state we want to pull ourselves towards, using like a futures triangle or a Citro triangle methodology there. I'd encourage you to focus them on self-regulation and frame them about how the past can help us contextualise the future. All right, gentlemen in table 14, do we have some questions from the audience?
Yes, the first question we have is from Ben W. It would appear 9RAR had the most discipline issues. What links did you find between discipline and a battalion's experience on operations, taking into account the amount of casualties 9RAR suffered? Great,
well, thank you to Ben W. Was that right? Yeah, thanks to Ben. So this is clearly a question immediately for Bob. Yeah. And then if there are any other inputs, we'll take them. Yeah, Bob, your view on the links between 9RAR's disciplinary record and their operational record?
Yeah, that's a very key issue. Unfortunately, in 20 minutes, you can't cram all these details into a talk. But one of the things that emerges from looking at these records is that there is a strong link between ill discipline and intense combat leading to high casualties. And in 9RAR's case, they had, and particularly interestingly in B Company 9RAR's case, they had a very torrid time early in their tour of duty in Vietnam. In the Vietnam War, the peak period for bunker system attacks was 1969, and 9RAR was in Vietnam in that year and fought a lot of bunker system attacks. They were very costly in terms of casualties. And so those casualties tended to lead to a peak in offences when the battalion got back to Vietnam. And that's particularly the case for B Company. I think B Company suffered the most casualties of any of the companies in 9RAR. And B Company was very prominent in alcohol-related offences, and it's also the company in which Robert Convery was serving when he was killed.
Thank you, Bob, and thank you, Ben, for that brave question. Thank you. What else have we got?
So the next question is from Cameron, and this is for Sam and Norman. Thank you. Could you please discuss what gap or shortfall you believe that Indigenous conflict management traditions can help address in our current understanding of war and in our current doctrine?
Okay, I was having a bit of trouble hearing that one, but I think we've got a question directed to Norman and Sam to talk about the links between Indigenous approaches to discipline and the conduct of war.
Yes, that's correct.
Great, thank you, gents.
Yeah. I just want to talk about what rapidity means in our language. Rapidity is a bigger responsibility to give changes where bad behaviours become good behaviours. So it's a matter of being sensible. So rapidity means disciplined. A matter of being sensible where we kind of encourage and support our young soldiers to become from bad behaviours to changes to good behaviours. And that's a part of the rapidity. That's our leadership in the rapidity particular's name, where it's a whole number of names of rapidity where you can do rapidity punishment, rapidity verbally talking to the young people and giving them discipline as well. Do you want to head on that too?
I think in sort of 2 points, one being contemporary recruitment and retention. A big point out of Arnhem Squadron is when you're trying to conduct discipline within, for example, Arnhem Squadron, Northforce generally, when you have a reserve workforce, but you need them to be able to maintain combat effectiveness. I mean, having worked a lot with OC Arnhem and the SSM up there, using rapery as opposed to the military justice system or concurrent to the military justice system is a way that they've been able to retain, actually, a lot of Northforce members. The second point of the first question in terms of how does this apply within modern doctrine and modern concepts, I mean, it goes back to the idea of if you look at alternate models, right? If we're stuck within a framework of only looking at war as being one construct, there's some excellent work within the Australian Defence Journal, etc., that this concept of war and peace, this binary within international law, within strategic thinking, it's not only dated, but it's dangerous to maintain from a doctrinal perspective. Yes, international law requires armed conflict to flick over. That's when the Geneva Conventions come into play, when there is armed conflict. But that's not how our competitors think. It's not how our competitors work. We all kind of know that. There's different concepts of war, say with China. China has the psychological, the legal, and the conventional approaches to how warfare works. If you want to start looking at alternate models of conflict as members of defence, you have to start looking outside of Europe.
We have more questions coming in, but indulge me for a second. I'm going to ask Norman and Sam to expand very briefly, if you wouldn't mind, on how does the concept of rapery and self-regulation support the training of ethical decision-making in combat for a future war that Australia will fight?
Yeah. So the concept of rapery kind of goes back to the point I was making about how the concept of violence differs based on your culture, right? So across the continent of Australia, violence in Indigenous and Torres Strait Islander society is a public matter. It's something that everyone is involved in. It is disciplined by everyone. There is not just one individual whose job is to maintain discipline, right? The application of that to the army is pretty clear. It's not only the SSM or the CSM or the sergeant who should be responsible, but it's every single person at all levels holds a moral responsibility to keep each other accountable. That's rapery. You want to talk about how it works?
Yeah, the rapery works out like it's hand-to-hand collaboration and encouraging and supporting to kind of build the young leaders to step up to another level.
You can link in doctrinally to the idea of good soldiering, moral courage, everyone working together. There's the idea that you don't ask your mates to lie for you, right? This idea of maintaining discipline at all levels of the unit, that is rapery.
Thank you, gentlemen. More questions?
Thank you. The next question is from Kieran. With the continually growing requirements and responsibilities on commanders, combined with ever-increasing scrutiny on legal processes, how do we as an army support commanders in conducting discipline?
Okay, great. So this one is going straight to Jim Waddell. And my synthesis of this question from Kieran, was that right? Great question from Kieran, is that there's increased demands, increased responsibilities on commanders in the Australian Army. And so how are we enabling and supporting them to apply service discipline in a fair, equitable, timely and accurate manner? And apologies to Kieran if I've modified that slightly.
Yes, that's a very good question. The demands on commanders, particularly commanding officers, are enormous. They seem to increase exponentially. Commanders, I think, have been prepared for their discipline functions, their formal discipline functions, with varying rates of consistency over the decades, I have to say, particularly as between each service. The systems have become increasingly complex. The introduction of the discipline officer system in 1995, the infringement notice scheme that many of you will be familiar with, was an attempt to enable the dispensation of discipline by less formal administrative means and for very minor offences. And that certainly had the effect of greatly removing a vast quantity of minor offending from a complex system. That has conversely had the effect that the experience that unit staff have in the summary trial system is even less. So to some extent, a vicious cycle. A lot has been said in recent years about the increasing use of administrative sanctions to produce a discipline effect. We've noticed that trend over the years. One of the problems with administrative sanctions is that they don't really have any general deterrent effect because a sanction is administered behind closed doors. Privacy laws prevent the rest of the unit from being made aware of how the punishment fits the crime. In fact, administrative sanctions are said to be more applicable to a volunteer army because they have career consequences. May not work in a conscript army. I'll just make one more comment, and that is that in the federal court last year, there was a case in which Justice Logan questioned whether the use of administrative sanctions to produce a discipline effect may have the effect of subverting the checks and balances provided by the Defence Force Discipline Act. He didn't need to answer that question.
Thank you, Jim. Yes, please, Sam.
Just to add on to that, one thing I find quite interesting within the contemporary discipline system is, and looking at the statistics from Bob, 28 days in detention, right, on a large scale. And yet when you go to DFCE currently, I think presumably there's 1 or 2 people there with a big dog and 8 or 9 people guarding DFCE. But it's a process that seems to have dropped off quite massively since Vietnam. I mean, we don't seem to use DFCE anymore, and if they do, often there's an administrative termination that comes afterwards, which is the point that Colonel Waddell's making, that Justice Logan was also making, is there's no point sending someone to DFC if you then turn around and terminate them. It's a point that I think doesn't get raised a lot, is how DFCE is used contemporarily.
There's a lot in this too.
Yeah,
please.
Just a point about, I can't really comment on today, obviously, but in the Vietnam era, I think there was a problem with providing training to junior commanders about the administration of justice and discipline. One of the issues that emerged in 1969, you know, we'd been at war for 3 years by then, was an issue to do with the proper disposal of enemy bodies and the treatment of the dead. It followed an incident where some bodies had been towed behind an armoured personnel carrier, and it emerged that there had been no advice given to junior commanders in particular about the Geneva Conventions and how they were to be followed. So the issue in Vietnam and in the Vietnam era is a negative one, that you know, there should have been much more training and impartation of the behaviours that needed to be followed than there was.
So for Kieran, if I can summarise what I think we've gleaned from your responses, gentlemen, there are two most salient things we're doing to support our commanders. The first is training and disciplinary approaches writ large, and in your example, Bob, in the Geneva Convention in particular, but also furnishing them with broader, more alternate pathways to address a variety of disciplinary issues. And clearly there is a historical aspect to this, where we're talking about how we've supported commanders in the past, but this can be applied in the future, especially as war continues to be characterised by chaos, friction, danger and uncertainty. There's a hand in the back of the room. Yeah, I will, and then Tim will skin me later. And I think it's Colonel Roland Spackman, Headquarters 1 Div. Okay, so our question will be directed to Dr. Bob, and we've got a little bit of time for it, but probably not too much, is the extent to which there is a correlation between the volunteer force in the first ATF and the national servicemen with whom they were serving. Dr. Bob.
Yes, I've looked at that issue, and I found that national servicemen actually were less likely to commit offences than regular soldiers. They were also less likely to commit offences related to alcohol in particular than ARA soldiers. So that is an issue that does emerge statistically in the records.
Thank you very much. And we have, I think, time for a final question over from table 14.
So the final question comes from Cameron and it's directed to Sam. Why do we assume that peace and war are an unhelpful binary construct? How is one of competition more helpful? Is there any evidence that alternative approaches are more successful?
My apologies. Can you say again the first part? I just can't hear you.
So Sam, why do we assume that peace and war are an unhelpful binary construct?
So do you have another question from Cameron, or from a second Cameron? It's directed to Sam about the extent to which war and peace is a useful binary construct. I'm anticipating that this is in the context of a cooperation, competition, conflict spectrum, which is probably more redolent with a contemporary audience.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if I did say that it's a better model, I misspoke, but I don't think I did say that. I don't think that peace and war as a concept is any better or worse than another. The difficulty is that 3 years ago, when the United States said that they had done away with war and they had invented a new concept called campaigning and competition, and we have followed. We act like it's a brand new thing. It's not. Competition is older than war. They're always competing with one another. The point is that peace and war is a really strict binary reflected in international law, reflected in our own Defence Act, that at war we don't have to pay money when we commandeer bullocks, for example, under the Defence Act. I mean, these are cultural things that are stuck in law and stuck in international law, and we are evolving past that in terms of how we actually do war fighting. So rather than being stuck in that binary and thinking in that binary, which is what happens as we go through training, you have to also look at other models and see what other people are doing. That's the point I was trying to make.
Thanks for the question, Cameron. We're at time. This has been an intriguing first session, and we've been very lucky to hear from Major Samuel White, Sergeant Norman Daymirringu, Dr. Robert Hall, and Colonel Jim Waddell. Please join me in thanking them for their insights and their honesty.